In this video, I'm going to go through some of the options for exporting your film once it's complete. There are a lot of different codecs to choose from and some of the other settings that you may get lost in. So I'm going to take you through a couple of my recommendations on how you should export your film for various channels and uses. One of the first things that you want to do before you finish up and hit the export button is make sure that you have selected the timeline, so the sequence that you're planning to export. And then I'm going to hit the bracket key, and that's going to show me my entire timeline here. So if I had any straggling clips off here that I'd forgotten about, which would export and make my film really long, perhaps. I've had many situations with students where they've exported a 17-minute film, even though they really only made a 3-minute movie. That extra little clip from the rough cut is still hanging out over there around minute 17. The next thing you want to do is make sure that if you have any ins or outs set, that they're set in the correct place. So if I had an in point or an out point that I actually wanted to use because I was cutting off the front end, or wanted to export only a certain sequence, I would want to make sure that my ins and outs are set correctly or removed if I don't plan to use them. Finally, before exporting, make sure that you have your channels for audio and video turned on if you plan to have them turned on. If you were muting or soloing something for your sound mix, now would be a good time to make sure that all of your channels are on. Nothing is more disappointing than exporting your film only to realize much later that you're missing the sound effects from channel 6. So please make sure that you have all of your stuff ready to go. So it looks like I'm ready to go here. I'm going to choose File, Export Media, or Command M. So once this window opens up, I can see a preview of my film. I can match my sequence setting, so it's going to match exactly. That's one possibility. Now for format, depending on what you've last used, or if you've never exported your film before, Premiere may have some options for you. In general, they're probably wrong. So for format, knowing what to export your video as is as important as knowing how to operate the camera. Because there are so many different types of codecs out there, you want to get the best quality, the smallest file size, but those don't necessarily play nice together. The development of codecs over the many years that I've been doing production has changed a lot, and so how much quality we can get out of the file size has changed significantly. Right now we're using quite frequently the H.265 codec, or HEVC. And some of the other folks might be more familiar with H.264. That was obviously the predecessor to H.265. These are all variations on MPEG-4. So MPEG-4 also is an option here, but H.264 and H.265 are moving that quality setting to a higher level. We also have some more legacy options here for DVDs and Blu-rays and things like that. I'd like to point out the QuickTime option that may only be available on the Mac depending on your system. And so a lot of folks choose QuickTime and then choose a ProRes option. In this case, I might choose ProRes 422 HQ for high quality. What this is going to do, it doesn't even estimate what my file size is because it doesn't care. It's ProRes. It's going to tell you that this is as big as it's going to be. And so this would be something I would export my film as a master file. So once I've got picture lock and I'm all done with this movie, it's been mixed and married back with the sound, I'm going to choose that option perhaps as the definitive master copy of my film, but that's not necessarily what I want to use to distribute to the actors or to other distribution channels because it is going to be a very large file size. Today I'm going to choose H.265 HEVC. Under preset, it's going to give me some variables here if I'm doing 1080, if I'm doing 4K, and other options. Now, one of the tricks that I found, I'll show you in a little bit here, is to actually choose a resolution higher than what you are actually compressing for. So we'll come back to that in just a moment. My output name, this is where I'm going to choose where the file is going to end up. So if I am choosing for this file to go onto my drive and name it whatever this project is called, and then I would click save. So that once I export it is going to go to that folder, and it's going to be named this.mp4. At this point, I could also choose if I don't have audio on my project, I could discontinue that right there. Let's take a look down at the video settings. So based on my match source high bitrate, the project itself is a 4K project, so that size is appropriate. I'm going to be using hardware encoding. I don't need to change any of that stuff. Most of this stuff is grayed out for that particular codec. So when we get down to the bitrate settings, the bitrate is essentially your quality setting, right? So the higher this bitrate setting is, the better my film is going to look. Now, it really uses that additional bitrate if you have lots of action in your sequence and movement, if you have a lot of handheld type shots, and when you export this with the default setting, it may start to look a little bit like a watercolor, I like to say, because it doesn't look very sharp or precise like some of the other shots did or will. And so that has to do with bitrate. How much data can it process for and hang on to during that compression? So if I crank this all the way up, I only get to 25. So using the default preset of high quality, 25 is as high as I can go with this. Now we know that this is actually 4K material. It's 4K DCI, but their preset is 4K UHD. So when I clicked that preset, you'll see that it put some very skinny letterboxing on my video. Now I'm going to come back down into the basic video settings, right? Because I was all the way down here in bitrate before, which we're going to go back to in a moment. But right now I chose the preset for 4K because I was working with 4K material, and I'm going to click the match source button. Great. Now when I match source, it got rid of those letterboxing and it made it 4096 by 2160, which is the actual dimensions of my project. Now when we scroll down to the bitrate, it has chosen 35 as the default for 4K. Even though it says custom now, that's because I changed the size. It was 3840 UHD, and now I changed it to 4096 for DCI. All right, but it still left my 35 megabits. The maximum that I could go was 25. So I've opened up additional bitrate just by going to 4K, because 35, frankly, is a good setting for my 4K video. I might even, if I had a lot of action in this sequence, which I don't, it's mostly a talking heads piece, I would crank this up even higher, perhaps. Now, if we did the same thing and chose 8K, and then chose match source, it's going to still make it 4096. Let's see what happens down here with our bit rates. And sure enough, it's going to give me a target bit rate of 120. So even though my sequence is 4K and it's going to export it as 4K, I was able to open up additional bitrate options in this setting here. Now, whether or not Premiere actually does anything with that or not, I'm not sure. My target size down here is 3721. If I drop this down to 35 where it was before, it says it's going to be about a gig. All right, that seems pretty accurate. And if I go back to my 4K UHD match source again and choose leave it at 35, sure enough, it's going to be at about a gig. Now this export window is also a place where I can make other versions. So perhaps I want a 1080 version of this project and I want to export it. I can do that using the basic video settings here. So if I wanted to export a version of this project in a 1080 option, I can deselect, or excuse me, I can link these together and make my source 1080, and that's going to be my 2K version, my 2048 by 1080. So it's going to, in the export, it's going to compress that down as well as make the file 1080. Now, because that is a smaller file, I could reduce my bitrate if I wanted to crunch my file size a little bit. Again, for 1080 in H.265, a normal bitrate, according to the defaults, is around 7. So if I double that and go with something like 15 or 16, that's going to give me a 500 meg file. So I've thrown a lot of numbers in here, but just know that if I chose H.264, and we've got a 4K quality right there, and we're choosing match source there. I'm going to go down and check out my bit rates. My bit rates, it's a much different scale, and so my target bit rate for 4K is around 80 is pretty reasonable, whereas in H.265, 35 megabit per second was basically the normal. So that doubles, which also doubles my size. So we're pushing 3 or 2.5 gigs worth of stuff in H.264, whereas in H.265 that was about a gig, if I recall. Oops. Yeah, 1092. So I'm all set with that. I definitely want to use, I'm getting all of the quality of H.264 and then some, and half the size. So that's fantastic. In terms of some of the other features of my export here, with audio, I still don't have a lot of choice in terms of quality settings. It basically is going to give me a 320 kilobit per second bit rate on that. It doesn't really go any higher for this codec. So I'm left with that. The multiplexer, that's basically what the file type is going to be. Captions option, if you've created those, how it gets published. And if I had any effects on here, if I wanted to add a watermark, or if I'm adding a LUT in the export, time code options, if I'm doing something with a client. And so there's some other features there as well. If I'm only exporting one version of this project right now, I would choose the export. It's going to begin working on that. If I choose the queue, that's going to open the media encoder as a separate standalone application. Adobe Media Encoder is going to create a list of things that need to be compressed. And so the queue is a way for me to set up and export multiple versions of the project in one go, rather than export, wait, export, wait. I could just set them all up and choose go, and it would actually export them all. And once I'm done, yeah, they'd be complete. It just depends on how you want to use those two options right there. Finally, one of the things I recommend is that if you have a troublesome sequence, I would definitely do some testing on that before. If you have a longer format project and you're having difficulty with a couple of scenes or shots that aren't looking very good once compressed, I would definitely do some experimentation, use your eyes, decide what works best for you and your project, and make sure that the settings then are documented. There's no default, even though there is a default, there's no default setting for the best looking video. What I can recommend though is that bitrate is your key, but if you have file size limitations, for example, you have a Vimeo account and you have to, fit your weekly uploads under a certain gigabyte amount, using the H.265 codec has allowed me to put longer format stuff up on Vimeo using higher quality. So that's fantastic. YouTube will take ProRes files and H.265 and H.264, and it doesn't seem to really care which one. Though I have understood from other users that choosing a higher quality, so if I choose something like UHD or 4K, if I was working with 1080 material, or choosing even 8K in this case, and exporting it at that higher resolution than I'm actually shot this at, and to upload to YouTube. So websites like Vimeo and YouTube actually recompress your image once more. And their secret formulas are just that. They're secret. We don't know exactly what those codecs are doing and how they're processing things. Some folks have speculated over the years on, best settings to use. But in general, giving them the highest quality possible for your project is going to benefit you in terms of quality. So that's what I would recommend.